Beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean lies a world you were never meant to find. A realm where all the laws of life as you understand them, light, warmth, pressure, are not just challenged, but shattered. Creatures here exist in forms that biology says shouldn't be possible. As we descend deeper, past the point where the ocean floor should end, the horrors we encounter grow more alien, more extreme, more impossible. This is a place untouched, unseen, and almost unimaginable. This is the Mariana Trench. It was 1872 when the HMS Challenger, a Pearl-class corvette of the Royal Navy, slipped out of Portsmouth Harbour and into history. No one aboard truly knew what lay ahead. What began as a mission of scientific curiosity would quietly become one of the most consequential voyages ever undertaken by humankind. For 3 years, the Challenger and her crew pushed through uncharted waters, cataloguing creatures and currents that no human eye had ever seen. But it was on a single, unremarkable morning, March 23, 1875, that everything changed. Near the remote Mariana Islands in the Western Pacific, the crew did what they had done hundreds of times before. They dropped a weighted line into the sea to measure the depth of the sea floor, an ancient technique as humble as the ocean itself. The line descended and descended. The men watched in silence as fathom after fathom of rope disappeared beneath the surface. Then the rope ran out. More was spliced on, still nothing. The line kept going, swallowed by a darkness that seemingly had no end. When it finally touched bottom, the men stared at the measurement in disbelief. Over 8,000 meters, more than 5 miles straight down. They had not been searching for it. They had not even imagined it existed. And yet, there it was. The deepest point on the surface of the entire Earth, discovered entirely by accident. It would come to be known as the Challenger Deep. Before we get into the Mariana Trench in detail, it's worth pausing at the zone that starts above it, the Hadal Zone. Named after Hades, the Greek god of the underworld, it begins where the ocean floor drops sharply into trenches, canyons, and narrow fissures. In the Mariana Trench, that means anything below 6,000 meters. From there down to the very bottom, roughly 11 kilometers, you are in the Hadal Zone. It is the least explored habitat on Earth, not metaphorically, literally. Fewer scientific visits have been made to the Hadal Zone of the Mariana Trench than to the surface of the Moon. At 6,000 meters, the water pressure is already around 600 times what you experience at sea level. By the time you approach 11 kilometers, that number climbs to over 1,000 atmospheres. To put that in physical terms, every square inch of surface area is bearing roughly 7 tons of force. A submarine not specifically engineered for these depths would be crushed instantly. Deep in the Hadal Zone, the Mariana Trench stretches nearly 2,550 kilometers across the Pacific floor. A scar in the Earth's crust so vast it defies comprehension. But length alone doesn't capture its true terror. At its deepest point, the ocean plunges nearly 11 kilometers down into absolute darkness. To grasp the sheer scale of this abyss, imagine taking the entire Mount Everest and dropping it into these waters. The summit would vanish beneath more than a mile of crushing ocean, completely submerged, swallowed whole by the deep. Not a trace would remain. and still, even then, you would not have reached the bottom. The answer to how the Mariana Trench came to exist lies in a collision that began millions of years ago, one so violent and slow that its consequences are still unfolding beneath us. The massive Pacific plate, dense and relentless, was moving steadily westward when it met the smaller Mariana plate. With no room to yield, the heavier Pacific plate was forced downward, bending under the weight of the encounter and plunging at a steep angle into the Earth's mantle in a process known as subduction. As it descended, the Mariana plate above it was dragged inward, and the seafloor between them tore open into a V-shaped wound, deep, narrow, and unforgiving. What we now call the Mariana Trench is the preserved scar of that collision, the precise geological seam where one world was swallowed by another. And as testament to how dramatically the Earth reshapes itself in these moments, the very same forces that drove the trench downward also pushed material upward, giving rise to the Mariana Islands, a chain of 15 landmasses running parallel to the trench, just 200 kilometers to the east, standing above the waves as silent evidence of the same catastrophic event unfolding in two opposite directions at once. For most of human history, no one thought anything lived down in this trench. The pressure alone seemed to guarantee it. At these depths, water pressure becomes so immense that it compresses steel. And yet, in 1998, an unmanned Japanese submersible called Kaiko filmed something at the bottom of the Challenger Deep that researchers had not anticipated. A swarm of amphipods, shrimp-like creatures that, by every calculation, should have had their shells dissolved by the acidic conditions long before reaching this depth. The species is called Hirondelia gigas. They are enormous by deep-sea standards, some reaching several centimeters in length, which, at these depths, is almost grotesquely large. More surprisingly, they retain their exoskeletons entirely intact. Researchers eventually discovered how the amphipods extract aluminum ions from the seafloor sediment as they forage for food, then use those ions to coat and reinforce their shells. In the most corrosive environment on Earth, a crustacean solved the chemistry problem with resources it finds underfoot. From the surface, miles above, a slow, constant drift of organic matter descends through the water column. The remains of animals that died in the sunlit world and are now, slowly, sinking toward the dark. This phenomenon is known as marine snow. It falls for weeks before it reaches the bottom. By the time it arrives, it has traveled through every layer of the ocean, and whatever nutrition it carried has been partly consumed by creatures living in the water above. What reaches the trench floor is already depleted. And yet, everything down here is built around catching it. The seafloor, in places, is thick with sediment that is almost entirely composed of this accumulated fall. Millions of years of slow descent, compressed into the ground these animals walk on. Spread across the seafloor in shimmering mats, single-celled bacteria survive not on sunlight, but on chemicals leaching from the rock. They convert those chemicals into energy, a process called chemosynthesis, and in doing so, they become the base of a food chain that should not exist. Everything living down here, ultimately, is eating bacteria, or eating something that ate bacteria. The entire ecosystem runs on chemical darkness. The deepest known vertebrate on Earth, the Mariana snailfish, lives at 8,000 meters. It is pale, almost translucent, and moves through the water with a gentle, boneless undulation that makes it look more like a wisp of tissue paper than a fish. Its skull is not fully fused. At these pressures, rigid bone would be a liability. Instead, to survive in conditions that would liquefy a human body in seconds. And then there is the light. In an environment with no sunlight at any depth at any time of year, an estimated 3/4 of all deep-sea creatures produce their own bioluminescence, cold chemical light generated by living tissue. Some use it to lure prey, some flash it to confuse predators. Some use patterns of light along their bodies the way other animals use color or sound for recognition, for communication. The deep-sea jellyfish that drifted through absolute darkness pulses blue-green light that runs in waves along the edges of its bell. When threatened, these species shed glowing tissue, sacrificing a piece of themselves to confuse a predator while they slip away, using the light as decoy. The comb jelly that carries no sting, unlike jellyfish, has no hard defense of any kind. What it has instead is structure. 8 rows of cilia run the length of its translucent body, beating in coordinated waves that propel it forward. And when those rows catch the light the animal itself generates, they scatter it into a traveling rainbow, a slow, iridescent pulse moving stem to stern. The deep-sea shrimp turns bioluminescence into a weapon it fires. Certain species carry glands near their mouths loaded with luminescent fluid, and when grabbed, they eject it in a concentrated burst directly at whatever is attacking them. A cloud of cold light, sudden and blinding, released at close range. The predator flinches, giving time for the shrimp to escape. Other shrimp species use light differently. Photophores distributed along the underside of the body match the faint, diffuse glow filtering down from above, erasing their own silhouette from anything looking up from below. It is called counter-illumination, where the animal tunes its own output to match the ambient light and becomes effectively invisible to a predator beneath it. The most abundant visible animals in this zone are sea cucumbers, holothurians. They carpet the sea floor, making the bottom look soft and yielding. They move slowly, almost imperceptibly, sweeping the sediment with rings of feeding tentacles, extracting whatever nutrition they can find from the bacterial mats and the constant fall of marine snow from above. Then there are the xenophyrophores. They appear as crumpled forms scattered across the seafloor, pale, irregular masses stretching up to 20 centimeters wide. And yet each one is a single cell. The largest single-celled organisms on Earth, despite their fragile appearance, they construct intricate structures from sediment particles, binding them together with organic secretions. In doing so, they create microhabitats that shelter a surprising diversity of deep-sea life. Many creatures in the deep sea are translucent, nearly see-through. In that darkness, this would seem to offer no camouflage benefit at all. And yet, species after species has evolved this trait independently across millions of years. It may be a way to conserve the biological energy required to produce pigment, or perhaps something structural about how cells handle the immense pressure at these depths. The truth is, we still don't know. There are other things we don't know that are harder to sit with. Sounds have been recorded in the deep ocean that have no confirmed source. Some are low, resonant pulses that travel for miles, while others resemble distant metallic groans or biological calls unlike anything catalogued. In an environment where light cannot reach and pressure crushes most forms of life, these unexplained signals feel less like anomalies and more like reminders of how little we truly understand. Some species recorded in deep-sea footage appear only once, never seen again. Whether they are rare or simply present in parts of the trench no camera has reached is unknown. The trench has a floor, technically, but its walls contain hundreds of smaller ledges, overhangs, and sub-trenches, micro-environments that have never been surveyed. What lives in those is, at present, genuinely unknown. What makes the deep sea even more unsettling is not just what lives here, but what it does to the things that live here. The pressure, the cold, the scarcity of food, the absence of almost everything we associate with life-sustaining conditions. These forces do not simply limit organisms. In many cases, they expand them. This is the phenomenon scientists call deep-sea gigantism, and it operates with a kind of slow, patient logic that feels almost deliberate. Species that have shallow water relatives of modest, unremarkable size grow to dimensions down here that border on the surreal. The isopod offers one of the clearest illustrations. In shallow water, isopods are small, unremarkable creatures. But as depth increases, so does their form, until what was once an ordinary animal becomes something that feels like it belongs to a different world entirely. The unsettling part is not the size itself, it is the logic behind it. Depth and scale track each other across lineages that share no common ancestor. Species that arrived at the same outcome through millions of years of entirely separate evolution, as though the abyss were quietly enforcing a rule that we do not yet fully understand. It is not one anomaly, it is a pattern, and the deeper we look, the more consistent that pattern becomes. Which raises a question that marine science has not yet been able to answer with any certainty. If this is what we have found at the edges of our reach, what is still waiting in the parts of this trench that no instrument has ever touched? In January 1960, on a cold morning in the Pacific, two men climbed into a deep diving bathyscaphe, a highly specialized type of submersible engineered for extreme ocean depths, and were lowered into the deepest waters on Earth. Jacques Piccard had grown up around this machine. His father, Auguste, had designed it. Don Walsh was a US Navy captain, 38 years old, calm by profession. Neither of them had done this before. No one had. Piccard and Walsh descended at 0.9 meters per second. It is a slow speed, slower, but at that rate, falling through water that grows incrementally heavier with every meter. The effect is less of movement and more of settling. The world above becoming irrelevant, the world below still unknown. For the first 4 hours, the work was quiet and largely unglamorous. Gauges to monitor, depth calculations to run, instruments to read in a crew sphere just under 2 meters across, wide enough to sit in, but not to pace. The ocean pressed in from every direction with a force that climbs, at full depth, to over 1,000 times the pressure at sea level. Enough to compress the Trieste's hull by a fraction the engineers had already calculated and accepted before the mission began. At 9,000 meters, something went wrong. One of the outer plexiglass window panes cracked. The sound it made was sharp enough to shake both men and make the whole endeavor feel briefly uncertain. They checked the instruments and found the sphere intact, and the descent continued without further incident. The bottom arrived at 1:06 in the afternoon, 4 hours and 47 minutes after leaving the surface, when the Trieste settled into the sediment of Challenger Deep at 10,916 meters. The silt below them billowed up in a slow cloud, the way flour does when a bag is set down too quickly, and then gradually cleared. They had 20 minutes. This was not the original plan. The cracked window pane had introduced enough uncertainty that Walsh and Picard agreed. What they saw in that time became, for a while, a minor scientific controversy. Picard reported what appeared to be a flatfish resting on the sediment, which would have meant that vertebrate life had found a way to survive at pressures seemingly incompatible with the cellular structures fish rely on. Later analysis was considerably less certain, and the shape was probably not a fish at all, more likely a sea cucumber, or a trick of the disturbed sediment and the strange cast of the Trieste's lamps. Shrimp-like creatures were visible and confirmed. The bottom was not empty, but the details remained contested long after the vessel returned. They had spent less time on the bottom than it takes to watch a film, and the record they set, the deepest point ever reached by a human being, would go unchallenged for over 50 years. In 2019, researchers collected water samples and sediment from the Challenger Deep and found microplastics. Plastic fibers almost certainly from clothing. At 11 kilometers below the surface, in a place that has been visited by humans twice in a crewed vessel, human industrial waste had arrived first. The amphipods living at the bottom contained plastic in their digestive systems. Animals that evolved over millions of years to survive conditions that would kill anything we've ever built. Animals that thrive at pressures that destroy submarines were eating our trash. We have explored less than 0.001% of the Hadal Zone. We don't know what lives there. We don't know what it produces, what it consumes, what compounds its microorganisms have developed over hundreds of millions of years of isolation. We don't know what vital discoveries are sitting in that darkness right now. And we've already begun contaminating it. Who knows what we might lose before we understand what it was worth?